Masechet Holin Daf Ayin Tet 79. We saw a machloket between Hananya and Chachamim regarding Oto ve'et beno. When the Torah says that it's prohibited to slaughter a mother and an offspring, that definitely applies to a mother and its offspring boy or girl, that does not matter. It's prohibited, a mother and any offspring. That everybody agrees. The question, what about the father and offspring? According to Chachamim, that is permitted. According to Hananya, we take into account not only maternity when it comes to animals, but also paternity. The animal is also identified with its father, and therefore, when we learn from the word oto and from the word beno, that it's prohibited to slaughter either a mother and its offspring on the same day, and also a father and its offspring on the same day. So we see that Hananya takes into account the identity of the father. Amar Rav Huna bar Chaya Amar Shemuel Hilcheta keHananya. Shemuel says that the halacha follows Hananya, even though he's a minority opinion here. Ve'azda Shemuel ta'ameh, and Shemuel is consistent with what he says elsewhere. Whatever you say about Oto ve'et beno regarding the father will have an effect also when it comes to kilayim. Do we take into account paternity when it comes to kilayim? So here's a Mishnah in Masechet Kilayim. Ditnan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda, this is the Tana Rabbi Yehuda says, the fourth generation, Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai. Hanoladim min hasus, afal pisha vihen hamor, mutarim ze baze. Aval hanoladim min hahamor, im hanoladim min hasus asurin. Let's talk about some terminology first. If someone mates a female horse with a male donkey, you get a mule. Now, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to take a female horse and mate it with a male donkey. However, if someone does it, you create a mule, and you're allowed to use a mule. It's not kosher to eat, but it's a very strong animal, and people used it all the time for carrying heavy things. That's a mule. Now, the other way around, a female donkey with a male horse is called a hinny. We'll try to use those terms. Well, sometimes mule refers to both types, but if we're more specific, a mule is a female horse, is the mother, whereas a hinny, the mother is a donkey. Mules are much more useful than hinnies. Now, a mule can be male or female. When you mate a mother, a horse, with a donkey, it can create a male or a female offspring. And also a hinny can be male or female. So we're not going to deal with what the offspring is. That doesn't matter. Okay, so here's the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, if something is the offspring of a horse, so meaning that would be a mule, whose mother is a horse, with a donkey, even though the father is a donkey, they are permitted to each other. In other words, one is permitted to mate two mules together. Even though a Jew is not allowed to create the mule, you can't take a horse and a donkey and put them together. If you already have two mules, one male, one female, well, they're both the same. They both have a female horse as a mother and a male horse. So everybody agrees with that case, that a mule can be mated with a mule. Everybody would also agree that a male hinny can be joined with a female hinny. Those are easy cases. And now what he's adding is that as long as the mother is a horse, it doesn't matter who the father is. So you see, according to the Yehuda, we only follow maternity for identity of an animal. And therefore, at first reading, we're going to come back to this Mishnah in a few minutes, but in a simple reading, it sounds like he only cares about the mother. And therefore, if you have a mule whose mother is a horse, you could mate a mule with a full horse, because they both have mothers who are horses, even though the mule as a father is a donkey and a full horse has a father who's a horse. That's okay, because we only care about the mother. And then the Mishnah continues, something that has a mother who is a donkey and you cannot mate with something who has a mother who is a horse. And so therefore, it would be prohibited to mate a hinny. A hinny has a mother who's a donkey. You could not mate that with a mule, which has a mother that's a horse. Nor would you be allowed to mate a hinny with a full horse, because they have different types of mothers. Okay, so that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. ואמר רב יהודה אמר שמואל זו דברי רבי יהודה דאמר אין חוששים לזרע האב אבל חכמים אומרים כל מיני פרדות אחת הן. Shemuel says about that Mishnah that is only the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it says, it's Rabbi Yehuda, because he thinks that we do not take into account the father when we look at the identity of an animal, and therefore we don't care who the father is, it's only the mother. However, Chachamim, so in this case it's actually the majority opinion against Rabbi Yehuda, say that all types of mules, meaning mules or hinnies, are all one, and you can mix and match, and therefore you see that according to that, you are taking into account not only the mother, but also the father. And so if you have a hybrid with a hybrid, so you have a horse with a donkey, and another animal that's a female donkey with a male horse, a mule with a hinny, you can mate them together. And so you see, that is the opinion that says we do take into account the father, and in this particular case, that would be a leniency. So, man chachamim Hananyahu damar chosheshin lezera ha'av. Who is chachamim? In that case, that's Hananya. So even though Hananya is a minority opinion in Otovet Beno, but he's the majority opinion in Kilayim. And so you see Shemuel is consistent. Shemuel says regarding Otovet Beno, we follow Hananya. And he also explains that the majority opinion in Kilayim is against Rabbi Yehuda, and that would be the same as Hananya. V'hai bar susya v'hamara, v'hai bar hamara v'susya, kulehu chada mina ninhu. And therefore, if you have a mule with a hinny, that's permitted, because one of them is the offspring of a female horse and a donkey, and then the other one is a female donkey with a male horse, and we consider those to be the same. Even though they're switched, it doesn't matter. You have one parent is a male, one parent is a horse, one parent is a donkey. It doesn't matter which is which, according to Hananya, who says we do take into account both the father and the mother. Now we have a question about Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Mi pashit le Rabbi Yehuda de en chosheshin lezera ha'av, or dilma sapokim mesapeka le. Is Rabbi Yehuda clear for sure that we do not take into account at all the paternity? Or maybe what he means is that we're not sure. For sure we're going to take into account the mother, but regarding the father, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. And usually if you have a safek, that's actually going to be worse than knowing for sure which one it is, because then you have to take into account that possibility. Lemay nafkamina, what would be the practical difference between these two possibilities? Lemishra peri aim ha'em, to permit mating, an offspring of a hybrid with something that is fully the same as the mother. So, therefore, if you have a female horse and a male donkey, meaning a mule, could you mate that with a horse? If you say for sure he knows that you can ignore the father, then this would be permitted. You have a mule who has a horse as a mother, and you have a full horse who also has a horse as a mother, and we don't care the fact that the mule has a father who's a donkey and the full horse has a horse as a father. That doesn't matter, because we ignore the father, and therefore be permitted to mate a mule with a horse. That's the first possibility. But if you say he's not sure, maybe we should take into account the father and not only the mother. In that case, this would be prohibited, because now you have a mule that is from a female horse and a male donkey. And you're going to mate that with a full horse. Yeah, but they have different fathers. The mule has a donkey as a father, and the horse has a horse as a father, and those are different. Maybe we should take those into account, and therefore, maybe that would be prohibited. In other words, in this reading, only a mule with a mule would be permitted, and a hinny with a hinny, but a mule with a horse would not. Mai. What's the answer? We're going to bring a few attempted proofs. Tashema. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol hanoladim min hasus, אף על פי שאביהן חמור, מותרים זה בזה. We cite the Mishnah that we just cited above. That seems pretty clear. It says anything that is born from, is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, anything that is born from a horse, meaning the mother is a horse, even if the father is a donkey, are permitted to each other. And so, hechidami, what's the case? If you're talking about two animals that both of them have a donkey as a father, and a horse as a mother, do you need to tell me that? Is there any chidush there? They're exactly the same animal. Two mules. Both of them have a horse as a mother and a donkey as a father, so they're exactly the same. That would be obvious. Rather, it must be two animals. Both have horses as mothers, but one of them has a horse as a father and one of them has a donkey as a father, and it's saying that Rabbi Yehuda says it's okay. Rabbi Yehuda says they're permitted, so you see that it's obvious to him. He has no safek that we follow the mother only and do not care about paternity. Isn't that a good answer? No, maybe the Mishnah actually is talking about a case where that's a mule with a mule, that both of them have a horse as a mother and both have a donkey as a father. And that question that you asked, is that a chidush? Obviously that would be okay, a mule with a mule. I might have thought that the horse side of one animal, that's the mother side, may copulate, mix together with the male donkey side of the other animal, and vice versa, that the donkey side of one will mix together with the horse side of the other. In other words, when a mule mates with a mule, who says that the female parts, the horse and the horse, join together, and the male parts, the donkey with the donkey joined together, maybe, they didn't know about genes, but maybe the genes all mix and match, and therefore you do have mixing of different species. Even when you have a mule with a mule, still the horse half and the donkey half of each mixed together with each other, and it's prohibited. You might have thought that. Kamash malan. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda has to say that that is permitted. But maybe, in fact, he's only permitting a mule with a mule, but a mule with a horse, he would say prohibited. So we're not sure. This is not an absolute proof. So let's try again. Tashema. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Pirda shetab'a and marbi'in aleha lo sus velo hamor. Rabbi Yehuda says you have a female mule. So we mean here in more general, mule or hinny in heat. One cannot mate with it, not a horse and not a donkey. Elamina, rather the same as what it is. If it's a female mule, you can take a male mule and mate it, or if it's a female hinny in heat, and you can bring a male hinny, that you're allowed. That's what a baraita teaches, and it's Rabbi Yehuda. If you think that he knows for sure that we do not take into account paternity, then why do you have to bring, let's say it's a female mule, why do you have to bring only another mule, a male mule? Why not bring whatever the mother is? And if it's a mule, bring a horse. And we only care about maternity, and that would be okay. Or if it's a hinny, so the mother is a donkey, so bring a male, that's a full donkey, and that would be okay. Why does he say only mina? So that seems like a good proof, but we answer, no, we're talking about a case where we don't know what the mother species is. We have this animal, and they look very similar. It's a bit hard to tell, and we don't remember who mated with whom to get this here mule or hinny, and therefore we do not know what the mother is, and that's why we can't bring a full breed. Hold on, but the Baraita does say bring its own type, which means you do know what type it is. Otherwise, if you don't know if it's a mule or a hinny, then you wouldn't know if you could bring another mule or a hinny because you don't know what it is. So it must be that you do know what type it is, and if you know that the mother is a horse, then why can't you bring a full horse to mate with it? Hachika amar, this is how to understand the baraita. En marbi'in aleha, lo min sus velo min hamor, lefi she'en yodim bemina. Rather, the baraita is saying, you cannot bring a male to mate with it, not something that comes from a horse, nor something that it comes from the species of a donkey, neither, because we don't know what species it is. So actually the baraita is saying that you can't bring anything with it at all because you don't know what it is. And now we ask, why not check? There are ways to check if it's a mule or a hinny. Abaye explained, if it has a deep voice, then it's offspring of a female donkey. If it has a shrill voice, then its mother is a horse. V'amara papa, Rabreban udne vezutra genubte bar hamara, zutran udne veraba genubte bar susya. And Rapapa gave another sign. If its ears are big and its tail is small, then that means the mother is a donkey. If its ears are small and the tail is big, that means the mother is a horse. So therefore, based on these signs, you should be able to tell what it is. And then, if it's in fact a mule, so bring a horse to mate with it. And if it's a hinny, bring a donkey to mate with it. And you can tell based on the signs. Why doesn't the baraita say that? Oh, this baraita is talking about a mule whose ears and tails are also lopped off. So we can't hear how it brays, what it sounds like, and we cannot check the ears and the tail to see if they're big or small, and that's why we don't know what it is, and therefore we're stuck. We cannot bring a male to mate with it. All right, so this baraita leaves us at a dead end. We want to go back to the question, was Rabbi Yehuda sure or unsure? Mai have Allah, what's the bottom line? Tashema damar Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua hakom modim befri'im ha'em she'asur shema'mina sapoke mesapekale shema'mina. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says everybody agrees, Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda agree that if you have if you mate a hybrid with something that is purely the same as the mother, meaning a mule with a horse or a hinny with a donkey, it is prohibited. So what do we see from here? Even the Yehuda, certainly the Chachamim agree with that because they say we have to take into account both the mother and the father, and therefore if you have a mule with a horse, the mothers are the same, but the fathers are different, and therefore that's prohibited. And now we learn that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with this. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda says we're unsure, and we have to take into account the paternity as well, and therefore he also prohibits it. And this is a conclusion that Rabbi Yehuda also does suspect that perhaps we have to take into account paternity, so he's going to end up being stringent in this case as well. Amar le Rabbi Abba l'shama'eh, ime'ayelat li kod neyata berispak, ayen hanach dedamyan hadadeh ve'ayel li. We have a story about Rabbi Abba. He said to a servant, if you're going to bring me mules attached to a wagon to pull a wagon, when you're using animals together, they have to be of the same kind. That's another type of kilayim. Not only are you not allowed to mate different species together, you cannot have them work together because one is strong and one is weak, and it's going to make the weak one struggle. So he says, if you're bringing mules for a wagon, I want you to check them out and check these signs, their voices, their ears, and their tails, and bring for me only those that are the same and not of different species. Alma kasabat en chosheshin lezera ha'av. Now these signs that we just mentioned, they can only tell you who the mother is, not who the father is. And so since Rabbi Abba said, okay, just check these signs, that means he only cares about the mother. As long as the mothers are the same, and he doesn't care if the fathers are different species. So you see that he thinks that we do not worry about the species of the father. And furthermore, that these signs can be reliable on the deoraita level, because the law of working animals together is a Torah law. And if he says, yeah, use these signs in order to tell which are the same species from the same mother, that means he thinks that these signs can be applied even to a Torah law. Tanu Rabbanan, otovet beno noheg bekil'ayim u bekoi. Rabbi Eliezer omer, kil'ayim haba min ha'ez u'min ha'rachel, otovet beno noheg bo koi, and otovet beno noheg bo. A baraita teaches that the law of the prohibition of slaughtering an animal and its offspring on the same day applies also to kilayim. If you have a product of diverse kinds, then it will apply. So if you have a horse and then it gives birth to a mule, you cannot slaughter the horse and the mule on the same day. And it also applies to a koi. Now, a koi is something that has some aspects of a behema and some of a chaya. The law of otovet beno applies only to behema, only to domesticated animals, because the pasuk says shor or se and so on, which are examples of domesticated animals. It does not apply to hayot, like deer. You can kill the mother and the offspring on the same day. Now, koi is in between, as we're going to see. However, Tanakama thinks that it does apply to koi because a koi does have some aspects of being a behema. According to the Eliezer, otovet beno does apply to kil'ayim, and he gives an example of the offspring of a goat with a ewe, a goat and a sheep. If they would come together, it seems scientifically not sure that they can actually produce anything, but let's say if they did, then one would be prohibited from killing the mother and the offspring on the same day. And otovet beno, so there it does apply. However, koi, what it does not apply to, because according to the Eliezer, it has an aspect of being a haya, and therefore it does not apply. Amar Rav Chisda, ezehu koi shenechleku bo Rabbi Eliezer chachamim, ze haba min hataish umin hasebiya. Rav Chisda explains their machloket further. What is the case of a koi where the chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer have a disagreement? It's talking about a goat, the father is a goat that mates with a doe. Now, a doe here was siviyah. Standard translation would be a female deer. Problem here is also that a goat and a deer cannot have offspring. Rashi says it's talking not about a deer, but an ibex, which is a kind of a wild goat. And that those can mate and can have children. Okay, so we'll just translate as a doe. And if they mate, the father is a domesticated animal. The mother is a chaya, is not domesticated. And so that's the machloket, whether we consider the paternity, the father is a domesticated animal, so if you take it into account, then the otovet beno would apply. But if you ignore the father and only follow the mother is a chaya, and therefore otovet beno would not apply. So let's analyze this further. What exactly is the case? Are you talking about a case where you have a male goat and a female doe, and it gives birth, and you slaughter the mother and the offspring on the same day? However, Rav Chisda said about that case that everybody agrees, Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim agree, that if the mother is a siviyah and the offspring is a taish, is a goat, considering that the father is a goat, that the person that slaughters both of these is patur. Why? Because we actually only care about the type of mother that it is, of the parent that one is killing. Because it says se ubeno. You're not allowed to kill se, meaning a domesticated animal, with its offspring, the Torah says. And that excludes a sevi, a haya, with its offspring. It doesn't matter what the offspring is. When you decide, does the prohibition apply or not, the se, shod or se, otovet beno. So the oto there is referring to the parent. has to be a domesticated animal. So, if it's the case where one is slaughtering the mother, and the mother is a siviyah, which is a hayah, everybody would agree that is patur, because the mother itself is definitely a hayah. Doesn't matter what the offspring is. So maybe actually it's the other way around. It's the deer, the male deer, that mated with a female goat. In that case, the mother is a goat, which is a behema, and would apply. And you kill the mother, which is a goat, and the offspring, which is a hybrid. In that case, Rav Chisda also made it clear, everybody agrees, both Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim, that when the mother is a goat and the offspring is a deer, we're saying it's a deer on account of the half of it that's from its father, that one would be liable for killing the mother and the offspring on the same day, because the mother is a seh. It's clearly a behema, a domesticated animal, and the Torah says shor or seh, and so seh, if the mother is domesticated, beno kol tehu. It doesn't matter what the offspring is, one would be liable. And so therefore, when you're talking about the application of this koi, if it's applying to the mother and the offspring, well then we just look at what the mother is. And the mother is not a hybrid. If the mother is a chaya, then it does not apply. If the mother is a behema, then otovet beno does apply. And that's all that matters. The species of the offspring makes no difference. So the answer is le'olam betaish haba ala sibiyah v'yalda bat ubat yalda ben v'kashachit la v'libra. We're not talking about killing the first and second generation, but rather a second and third generation. When you have a male goat that mates with a female doe, and that gives birth to a hybrid. And that hybrid is a female. And that female gives birth to another offspring of its same type. And then one slaughters the mother and the middle generation with the son on the same day. And so now that mother that we are slaughtering is itself a hybrid. How do we define what it is, since its father is a goat and its mother is a wild animal? Rabbanan sabri, choshishin lezera ha'av, v'seh afilu miksat seh. The rabbis who are, say, prohibited, they say we do take into account paternity. Paternity, the father is a goat, that's a behemah. And when the Torah says seh, that you're not allowed to kill a domesticated animal, even if it's only half of a domesticated animal, even if its father is a goat and the mother is a hayah, still the prohibition will apply, and therefore one is liable for killing that mother and the son, meaning the second and third generation. Rabbi Eliezer sabar en choshishin lezera ha'av. However, Rabbi Eliezer thinks we do not take into account the paternity, and so that mother in the middle generation, we don't care that its father was a goat, only care about its mother was a hayah, and therefore it is a hayah, so there's no prohibition. And therefore, v'seh afilu miksat seh lo amrinan. We're not going to apply the idea that seh means even if it's partially a seh, because we're ignoring the paternity, and therefore there is no part of it that is a behema. The father is a goat, but we ignore that, and therefore we consider it only based on its mother, and its mother is a hayah. It is a hayah, and there's no law of a tovet beno. We ask, if you're telling me that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan, the basis of their argument, even though they're talking about this complicated case of a koi, a wild animal, and a domesticated animal coming together and having a child, and that one having a child. So they're talking about this complicated case, but their essence of the machloket is whether we take into account paternity or not. Well, why are you telling me that they argue about this case? Why not tell me that they argue about the case that we saw earlier, the machloket between Hananya and Rabbanan, whether or not Oto vet beno applies to killing a father and an offspring or not. Do we take into account paternity or not? That's a simpler case. And then you could just tell me that the Eliezer and Rabbanan, they also argue on the same matter as Hananya and Rabbanan do. And that would be simpler. Why do you have to tell me this whole case? And the answer is, if we told me about their disagreement only over there, they do, indeed would also disagree about the case of Hananya and Rabbanan, whether a father and offspring one is prohibited or not. They would disagree. But if you only taught me that, then I would not have known everything. Hava amina beha afilu rabbanan modu tesev afilu miksatse lo amrinan kamashmalan. I might have thought that in this case, even the rabbis would agree that you can kill the second and third generation together, even though they say we do take into account paternity. Right, Rabbanan in this machloket is the same as Hananya, that says we do take into account paternity. But I might have thought, yes, while Rabbanan does take into account paternity, so you would not be able to kill a father and an offspring on the same day like Hananya. But in this case, where you have the father is a goat and the mother is a haya, and then it has a daughter. Now that daughter, we do take into account the father, and the father is a goat. However, we might say that the word se applies only to something that is a 100% a se. And therefore, even though generally we take into account paternity, in this case, that middle generation is not 100% se. And so you might have thought that Otovet Beno will not apply to killing that daughter and its son, the second and third generation. So Kamash Malan, that's why you have to tell me that Rabbanan here has a second chidush. Not only do we take into account paternity, we also say that since that daughter is partially has half of it is from his father's side is a goat, is a behema, and that's sufficient. The word se, and that says, short oseh, you cannot kill otovet beno, that prohibition does apply even if it's not 100% aseh, a behema, even if it's only partially. We now further examine Rav Chista's thesis that the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim, when they talk about koi, is talking about a hybrid between a goat and a deer. Well, let's test this out regarding another subject matter. V'aditnan, koi, en shochatin oto b'yom tov. V'im shachatu en mechasin et damo. The law of shechita is that if one does shechita on a haya, then there's a mitzvah to cover the blood with dirt. If you slaughter a behema, there is no requirement to cover the blood. Now, if you do shechita on Yom Tov, which is permitted, Yom Tov, you're allowed to prepare food, even do shechita. So, if you have a behema, you can do shechita, don't cover the blood. If you do shechita on a haya on Yom Tov, also permitted, and you will cover the blood, even though covering the blood involves digging and involves some melacha, but it's required for the shechita, so that is permitted. This Mishnah, which is going to come up soon, says that a koi, because this has some aspects of a haya and like a behema, so it's kind of a safek this and that, do not do shechita on Yom Tov of a koi, because perhaps you have to cover the blood. And so then you're going to want to cover the blood, but maybe you don't have to. And you can't violate Yom Tov if you don't for sure have to violate Yom Tov. If you have to do something, if it's a mitzvah to cover the blood, then that overrides Yom Tov. But here, we're not sure if it overrides Yom Tov, because maybe you don't have to cover the blood. So fine, what are you going to do? Not cover the blood? But maybe it is a haya, and you have to cover the blood, and then you're not doing the mitzvah. So therefore, lecha techila, do not slaughter a koi on Yom Tov. Bidi avad, you already slaughtered it, and now the blood is there on the floor. Do not cover it with blood, because we're not going to actively violate Yom Tov just in case it's a haya, so we just leave it alone. B'may askinan. Now, what is this case of a koi? According to Rav Chista, who said that koi is talking about some kind of a hybrid, ilema betayi shaba al hasiviya v'yalda. Is it a male goat with a female haya that gives birth? and you're killing that offspring. Ben l'Rabbanan, ben Rabbi Eliezer, lishchot v'lichaseh, sebi, va'afilu miksat sevi. Then, whether you follow Rabbanan or Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan, who says we take into account paternity, but certainly at least you take into account maternity, and Rabbi Eliezer, who says we only care about maternity, well, either way, the mother in this case is a deer, and a deer you have to cover it. So for sure, for Rabbi Eliezer, you only think about the mother, and that's a chaya, so you have to cover it. And even according to Rabbanan, we say sevi, a deer, but that means even if it's only partially a deer, which it is, you are at least taking into account the mother, even if with also the father, so it's a half a deer, so you would have to cover it, and therefore you should be permitted to slaughter it. Lecha techila yom tov. So that can't be the case. Ela bisbi haba al hatiyasha v'yalda. Maybe the other way around. The father is a deer and it mates with a female goat. So then it definitely has maternity as a goat. If we follow Rabbanan, who takes into account both parents, so one of the parents, the deer, is a chaya, and therefore do shechita and cover it, because sevi, even if it's partial. And Rabbi Eliezer says we only take into account the mother, and the mother is a goat, behema, does not require, so lecha techila, do shechita and don't cover it. But again, there's no sefek, there's no reason to say lecha techila, not to slaughter it. So what's the case? And the answer is le'olam bisbi haba ala tiyasha. We're going to go back to the second answer of it being a deer, male, that goes with a female goat. V'Rabbanan sapuke mesapeke lehu I chosheshin lezerahav I en chosheshin. And the Rabbanan are actually not sure whether we should take into account the paternity or not. And so therefore, in this case, the father is a deer. So if you do take into account the father, then you have to cover it. But maybe we don't take into account the father, who is a chaya, and therefore you do not cover it. Since we don't know, lecha techila, do not slaughter it. That's the case. Now, since the Rabbanan are the ones that aren't sure whether you take into account paternity or not, then that means that Rabbi Eliezer knows for sure that we do not care about paternity at all, because otherwise, if they both are not sure, then they both be saying the same thing, which we're going to get to in just a few minutes. But right now, we're saying since Rabbanan are the ones that don't know, that means according to Rabbi Eliezer, we do know for sure that we do not take into account paternity. But now we challenge that conclusion based on yet another subject matter, and that is that when one does shechita on a behema, that's cholin, you have to give the foreleg, the jaw, and the maw to a kohen. It's one of the gifts that go to a kohen. That applies to a behema, but not to a chaya. Now here we have a baraita. Hazeroa v'halechayim v'akeba nohagim bakoi u'bakilayim. Rabbi Eliezer omer kilayim haba min ha'ez u'min ha'rachel chaya b'matanot min ha'koi patur min ha'matanot. See another machlok between Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer regarding these three parts of an animal that Chachamim say it applies to a koi and also to kilayim. You do shechita, you have to give the foreleg, the jaw, and the maw of the koi or of the kilayim to the kohen. Rabbi Eliezer says, let's see, if it's kilayim, that you have a goat and a ewe, those are both behemot, so therefore, for sure, the offspring, whatever it is a behemah. And you have to give all the gifts. That's clear. If it's a koi, then you do not exempt, because this is a half a chaya. What exactly is the case? If the father is a goat and the mother is a doe, and it gives birth, so now this offspring, if we follow maternity, it is going to be a chaya. So let's see. We understand the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer, who says you do not have to give, since he follows maternity, and the mother is a deer, chaya, so that doesn't require giving, and therefore we will not apply the principle of seh and even a partial seh, because it's the father who's the behemah, who's the seh. And we ignore the father completely, and therefore there's no obligation to give these gifts to the Kohen. Elal Rabbanan, nehide kasabri seh v'afilu miksat seh, bishlama palga layahib le. Idach palga lemale aite re'ayah dechoshishin lezera ha'av ushkol. According to Rabbanan, he does think that, first of all, he takes into account maternity and paternity. And he also thinks that even if it's only partially a seh, a behemah, so you still, the law of, is still considered a seh, and the laws of gifts will still apply to it. Okay, according to him, certainly half of it he would not have to give. The half that is a hayah, so he doesn't have to give. So he takes the foreleg, the jaw, and the maw, and half of it, the half that's from a hayah, he can keep for himself, he doesn't have to give. Now how about the other half? The half that would come from the father, who is a behemah? Well, in that case, if Rabbanan are misapekale, they're not sure, which was our conclusion up above, then the owner of the animal should be able to tell the Kohen, Hamotzi mechavero alav ha're'ayah. The halacha is in doubt, and therefore, if you can bring some kind of proof that we take into account paternity, then certainly come and take your half. But since that itself is up to debate, it's a doubt, so therefore I don't have to give you anything until go back to Har Sinai. Go bring an oral tradition that can prove your point. Until then, I don't have to give it. So even according to Rabbanan, why would they say that the giving of these gifts applies to a case of koi? It should not apply. Rather, let's propose the other way around, that the father is the deer, is the hayah, and the mother is the goat, and that's the behemah. So this could account for the opinion of Rabbanan, and according to that, when the Braita says the owner of the animal has to give, it doesn't mean he gives 100% of these three parts of the animal, but rather half. Why half? Well, we take into account the mother and then maybe the father. Well, the mother for sure, and she's a goat, and that's a behemah, so he definitely has to give from the half that came from the mother. Regarding the father, we said Rabbanan is safek, whether we take into account the mother, the father or not. If we do take into account, it's a chaya, he doesn't have to give anything. If we don't take it into account, well then the offspring is entirely behemah, and then we'd have to give all of it. But the owner of the animal can say to the Kohen, you prove one way or another, but unless you can prove it, I'm keeping the other half. So that accounts for the baraita. But Rabbi Eliezer says, we only take into account the mother. The father's identity makes no difference, and therefore the mother is a goat. So this koi offspring should be considered entirely a goat, and therefore the owner should have to give 100% of these three gifts, and yet Rabbi Eliezer says he's exempt completely. So now we cannot explain both Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer not in either scenario. And the answer is le'olam b'svi haba ala tiyasha v'yalda. Actually, it is talking about the second case of the father is a deer and the mother is a goat. And Rabbi Eliezer also is not sure whether we take into account the father or not. But now we ask a new question. We established above from the previous issue that for Rabbanan, they are not sure whether or not you take into account the paternity identity. And Rabbi Eliezer, we just proved, also thinks that we're not sure whether we take into account the father. But they both agree for sure you take into account the mother. Well, in that case, what's the machloket between them? They both are saying the same thing. And the answer is Beseh afilu miksat seh, v'Rabbanan sabre seh v'afilu miksat seh, v'Rabbi Eliezer sabar seh v'lo miksat seh. They're arguing about whether, when the Torah says a seh, that a certain law applies to a sheep, a domesticated animal, does that mean also if it's only half only partially aseh? Rabbanan say that if it's only partially aseh, yes, we consider that significant, and the law will apply. And Rabbi Eliezer says, when it says seh, only if it's 100% seh, then the law of a behemah applies, but not if it's only partial. On the next daf, Rav Papa will explain how we apply this principle to each of the issues that we brought up. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.